The First Crusade, at the end of the 11th century, resulted in the creation of the Crusader states. But nearly a half-century later, the Crusaders' position in the Holy Land was threatened with the fall of one of those states, the county of Edessa, prompting Pope Eugene III to call for a second Great Crusade. Led by two of the most powerful kings of Europe, the Second Crusade would have profound impacts both on the Holy Land and Christian Europe. But perhaps its most surprising impact came some 6,000 kilometers away from Jerusalem. The Siege of Lisbon in 1147 is history that deserves to be remembered.
The Crusader kingdoms, also called the Outremer or overseas, were established as a result of the First Crusade. Edessa was the first kingdom so established, created when French nobleman Baldwin of Boulogne was made count, following the death of Edessa's Greek Orthodox leader Thoros in a riot in 1098. Baldwin eventually was made king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the countency of Edessa fell to his family. The Crusader states, in addition to Jerusalem and Edessa, were the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli, were independent kingdoms. Of the four, Edessa was the easternmost and the only Crusader state that was landlocked. Its position was remote, making it more vulnerable, and the county faced conflict with its Muslim neighbors, poor relations with its neighbor, the Principality of Antioch, and pressure from the Byzantine Empire. In 1144, the city of Edessa fell to forces led by Imad al-Din Zengi after a 4-month siege, although parts of the former county remained under Crusader control. The loss of Edessa was the first loss for the Outremer and caused great concern when word reached Europe via pilgrims in 1145. Prompting Pope Eugene III to issue a papal bull calling for a new crusade and promising the remission of sins for all those who took the cross. While the European reaction was at first not enthusiastic, the impetus changed when Eugene supported French King Louis VII, who had already been planning a pilgrimage, and the impassioned preaching of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux convinced Conrad II, King of Germany, to participate.
Notably, while the goal was protection of the Holy Lands, Eugene promised the same indulgence to crusaders who were fighting pagan Slavic tribes in northern Europe and Moors in Iberia. As with the First Crusade, many of the crusaders were motivated by religious zeal, and the crusade was seen as much as a pilgrimage as well as a military campaign, although there was also always the prospect of wealth and plunder.
Louis took with him his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as well as some 15,000 French troops, and Conrad led another force of some 20,000, both traveling to the Holy Land via different routes. The movement of nobility and troops affected politics across Europe, including Norman England, at the time facing the secession crisis called the Anarchy. But not everyone engaging in the Second Crusade traveled with Louis and Conrad. According to a chronicle written in Latin, a large fleet left Dartmouth on the southeast coast of England on May 19, 1147. The fleet carried crusaders from England, Scotland, Normandy, Brittany, Flanders, and the Rhineland. Led by lesser nobles, crusader captains from England and the Low Countries, including the Count of Aarschot, the Castellan of Gestel, Simon of Dover, Hervey of Genville, and Andrew of London. King Stephen of England and David of Scotland both deferred because of the ongoing conflict in England. At least 3 chronicles mention the voyage, although they disagree in some details, but the group was large, by one account 164 ships, while another claims 200, numbering some 6,000 English, 5,000 German, and 2,000 Flemish troops. The fleet traveled across the Channel and along the coast of France and northern Iberia. In June, they stopped in the port city of Porto, in the newly established Kingdom of Portugal. Most of the Iberian Peninsula had been conquered in the Muslim expansion in the 8th century, overthrowing the Christian Visigothic kingdom. But a small section in the north, called the Kingdom of Asturias, protected by mountain barriers, had resisted. From that base, Christian monarchs had slowly driven south, seeking to expel the Moors in the nearly 800-year conflict called the Reconquista. By the 12th century, Asturias had become the Kingdom of Leon and Castile, and Porto had been recaptured and was part of the County of Portugal. In 1139, the Count of Portugal, Afonso, declared Portugal to be an independent kingdom, defeating his cousin, Alfonso VII of Leon, in the 1140 Battle of Valdevez, and securing his kingdom's independence in the Treaty of Zamora in 1143.
But Portugal was still new and small, and Afonso sought a bigger prize.
The history of the city of Lisbon dates back to the establishment of a Phoenician trading post in the first millennium BC. The name Lisbon might be derived from Phoenician, meaning safe harbor. Located at the mouth of the Tagus River, the longest river on the Iberian Peninsula, and with a large natural harbor, the city was repeatedly raided and occupied by the Carthaginians and the Romans, the Vandals and the Visigoths. In 714, the city had been taken by the Moors, who had taken advantage of a civil war inside the Visigothic kingdom to capture much of Iberia.
By the 12th century, Muslim Lisbon was a very wealthy city with one of the busiest harbors in all of Europe. Afonso knew that capturing Lisbon would bring prestige and wealth and secure his kingdom, and what's more, Lisbon was more and more vulnerable as the Moors in Iberia had fallen into internal strife, and the Caliphate of Cordoba had collapsed in 1131.
While the record is scant, Afonso apparently made his first attempt to take the city in 1137, but failed to breach the walls. One brief mention in an Anglo-Norman chronicle records that he secured the help of crusaders on pilgrimage in 1144 in an attempt to besiege the city, but that their numbers had been too small to maintain the siege.
But the fleet coming in 1147 offered opportunity.
The chronicles differ regarding the reason for the Crusader fleet stopping in Porta. The Crusaders would have been making periodic stops for food and water, and the stop would have been normal, but one account says they were forced to seek harbor due to a storm. While some have suggested that Afonso merely took advantage of chance with the arrival of the fleet, other accounts suggest that he had been well informed about their existence and progress. In any case, when the fleet stopped in Porto, they attended a sermon by the bishop, and the force of the sermon and promises by Afonso of wealth convinced the Crusaders to detour from their trip to the Holy Land and help Afonso take Lisbon from the Moors. An account of the siege, written in Latin by an Anglo-Fleming chaplain named Raoul, described the agreement Afonso made to secure the help of the Crusader army. I, Afonso, king of the Portuguese, with the consent of all my people, so that it may be remembered by future generations, do provide by this protocol of confirmation that the Franks who shall remain with me in the siege of the city of Lisbon shall have and take into their power and possession the goods of whatever kind belonging to the enemy, and that I and my men shall have no part whatever of them. The Franks shall freely have the ransom money for the enemy prisoners who are taken alive and who wish to be ransomed. The prisoners, moreover, they shall release to me, if they should perchance take the city. They shall have it and hold it until it has been searched and despoiled, both of the prisoners for ransom and of everything else. Then, when it has been as thoroughly searched as they wish, they shall turn it over to me. What's more, the Crusader captains would be granted fiefs in Afonso's kingdom. Afterwards, the city and the conquered territory shall, under my direction, be divided among the Franks according to ranks, as these are best known to me, to be held in accordance with the most honorable customs and liberties of the Franks. But there was no guarantee of success. Raoul described the challenges faced by the besiegers. The city of Lisbon at the time of our arrival consisted of 60,000 families paying taxes. This figure includes the suburbs round about, except the free ones, which pay taxes to no one. A circular wall there surrounds the top of the hill, and at the left and right the city walls descend to the banks of the Tagus River. The suburbs down below the city wall are cut into the banks of the river in such a way that each of them have a superbly fortified citadel. The place is girded with pitfalls. As to defenders, Raoul says that the city included 150,000 men, but although there were many citizens, the city had only 15,000 lances and shields with which to arm its men, and they therefore came out in shifts, exchanging their weapons with one another as their prince decreed. As to the city itself, Raoul writes, the city was populous beyond belief. The city's buildings were jammed so closely together that it was scarcely possible, save in the merchants' quarters, to find a street more than 8 feet wide. The reason for such a dense population was that there was no established religion there. Each man was a law unto himself. As a result, the basest element from every part of the world had gathered there, like the bilge water of a ship, a breeding ground for every kind of lust and impurity.
Here you have to take the account with a bit of skepticism, as Raoul was not just writing with the biases of his time and his religion, but also with an eye on how the future would judge the actions of his army.
Raoul reported that Afonso already had troops at the city when the Crusaders arrived. After the meal, some of our men landed from the ships on the shore next to the city. The Moors opposed their landing, but they were unable to withstand our forces and were driven back, but not without losses, to the gate of the suburb. But the men knew not to attack the walls, and instead invested for a siege, building a camp, while Wright's barely a stick's throw away from the walls. The combined force numbered 20 to 25,000. Anglo-Normans were positioned to the west of the city walls, the Fleming Germans to the east, and Afonso and the Portuguese to the north. Raoul's narrative describes struggles to capture and hold the city's suburbs, writing that the Moors made frequent sorties from the city gates, causing casualties on both sides. Dr. Kelly DeVries of Loyola University, Maryland, described the siege tactics in the 2007 book Battles of the Crusades. The Crusader trebuchets of the Battle of Lisbon were of the type known by modern term traction trebuchets, but referred to at the time as mangonels, Balric slings, or Perriers. The ones used at Lisbon were quite large. Dr. DeVries explains that the slings were powered by ropes pulled by teams of soldiers, estimated to number between 40 and 250, and could throw projectiles up to 122 meters or 400 feet before landing with significant force. The Crusaders also made use of siege towers to try to overcome the city walls. One constructed by the Anglo-Normans was too large and bogged down before it reached the walls, where it was destroyed by the defenders' trebuchets. An attempt to use the Crusader ships to cross over the seawall was also driven away by the defenders' trebuchets, and a tower made by the Fleming Germans made it to the wall, but only a small number were able to cross over the wall before it, too, was destroyed. The besiegers also used mining, digging under the walls, causing a section to collapse, but the most devastating blow might simply have been that the news finally reached the city that no Moorish relief force could be expected. On October 21st, with food supplies dwindling, winter approaching, and no hope of allies coming to break the siege, the city surrendered. And then, the brutality of war. Raoul writes, "The men of Cologne and the Flemings, when they saw in the city so many spurs to their greed, did not observe their oaths or their religious guarantees. They ran hither and yon, they plundered, they broke down doors, they rummaged through the interior of every house, they drove the citizens away and harassed them improperly and unjustly. They destroyed clothes and utensils. They treated virgins shamefully. They acted as if right and wrong were the same. They secretly took away everything which should have been common property. They even cut the throat of the elderly bishop of the city, slaying him against all right and justice." Raoul claims that the Normans and the English, however, for whom faith and religion were of the greatest importance, contemplating what such actions might lead to, remained quietly in their assigned position. But again, there's reason to be skeptical of such a claim, as Raoul was writing for an audience.
After the capture of the city, many of the Crusaders remained in Lisbon, which helped to secure the Christian nature of the city and helped to establish the long history of friendly relations between England and Portugal. But some of the Crusaders continued with the crusade, arriving in the Holy Land only to find out that the crusade had collapsed even before they arrived, amid squabbles between the European kings and the local Crusader kingdoms. In fact, the only significant accomplishment of the Second Crusade was the capture of Lisbon. The collapse of the Second Crusade would have dire long-term consequences for the Crusader kingdoms of the Outremer.
Again, accounts differ, and despite Raoul writing that the city surrendered, there's a legend that a Portuguese nobleman named Martim Moniz sacrificed himself, being crushed in the gates to keep them from being closed, allowing the besiegers to enter the city. There are parks, monuments, and a subway station named in his honor in Lisbon today.
As to the reconquest of Lisbon, it had profound impacts on world history. It was a major victory in the Reconquista. It helped to permanently establish the Kingdom of Portugal. Noted historian Harold Livermore wrote in the journal Portuguese Studies in 1990, "Without the independence of the Atlantic seaboard, it's hard to see how the voyages of discovery could have taken place, or how the resulting expansion of Europe could have taken the form that it did." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.